the 26th of July. And the missiles are flying towards the Crimean bridge.
Holy damn. Free wind. Oh my goodness.
The bridge was blown up. The bridge was blown up. New special operation of the SBU. Boo, bada-boo. And something terrible has begun in Crimea. A new series of explosions on the Tarkankut Peninsula, Donuslav, Evpatoria, Saksky district, Bakhchisarai, Kachi, Sevastopol. Explosions.
Just now, it was reported out of 12 missiles flying toward the bridges. Right now, you can see the Shonhar Bridge.
The SBU is launching a new phase of the special operation, attacking the Crimean bridge, military facilities, airfields, and military bases. Widespread panic and a rapid evacuation have now begun across the entire region of Crimea.
Ooh. We've been standing here since 4:25 in the morning. We've been here for about 5 hours, and in the 6th hour they turned us around and sent everyone home to rest.
We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan right now.
There it goes again. Oil depot.
A new series of explosions in Crimea. God, SBU, don't stop. Tarkankut, Donuslav, Evpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisarai district, Kacha, Sevastopol. Explosions. Panic has started in Crimea. There's an evacuation in Crimea. The SBU has launched the second phase of the special operation. The Kerch Bridge and Russia's nuclear triad. Ukraine is attacking two parts of Russia's nuclear triad: the Northern Fleet headquarters, the nuclear submarines in Severomorsk, strategic nuclear bombers, and the Kerch Bridge.
The bridge has been damaged. That is, at least one of the bridge's supports has been damaged. If we look at the overall attack on Russian strategic targets, and specifically strategic ones, because, for example, strikes on Russian strategic aviation aircraft are strategic targets, especially since there are 5 of them, as it turned out 5, just as we said. The thing is, Ukrainka wasn't counted. At least one confirmed Tuesday 95 AM at Ukrainka was hit. So strategic aviation, and after that the strategic bridge. The bridge truly has strategic significance because it connects the Russian Taman with our peninsula Crimea, and if it is put out of commission, destroyed in principle until we liberate Crimea, or, for example, until it becomes possible to approach with a bomber and simply drop hundreds of aerial bombs on this bridge, it cannot be destroyed. There are certain factors that make it impossible to do this. Only engineering methods can be used to destroy. That is, it would require blowing up all the pillars. In other words, you would have to lay charges, but there will be a lot of problems, at the very least with deactivating it from its active state. But simply damaging it for the time being, as was done by the security service in the past, both in 2022 and 2023, to disable it for a certain period, at least for half a year, for example, during the summer campaign, that is indeed possible. Moreover, a significant strike, specifically on the strategically vital Kerch Bridge, is intrinsically tied to the very beginning of our comprehensive liberation campaign for the complete deoccupation of the Crimean Peninsula. Why is this the case? Because it is absolutely necessary to first destroy this bridge, or damage it, or put it out of commission. There are different ways to disable it so that the Russians cannot transfer a sufficient number of troops to Crimea. After that, using long-range strike capabilities, those same drones, missiles, it's only 200 to 300 kilometers to Crimea. We have the capability, almost everything we have can fly that far. In other words, that's the main range for our long-range operational level strike assets, which are also operated by the security service. That's why I think the next wave will be a strike specifically targeting military facilities in Crimea, of which there are at least 100 stationary ones currently operating and about 100 mobile ones as well. So the intelligence services have a tremendous amount of work ahead of them, but this can already be considered a strike on the Kerch Bridge. This is the beginning of the liberation campaign in Crimea.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the nuclear triad, I heard a comment from Kit Kalagu has simply stunned. He believes this is an enormous, colossal problem for Russia. This is called escalation. That Ukraine struck at the nuclear triad of the Russian Federation at two components, right? That's the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation, where the nuclear submarines are located, and of course the strategic nuclear aviation. How much of a breakthrough is this? And do you feel that the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the second phase of the SBU special operation?
Well, that means there will be a third phase as well. If, for example, a Russian submarine gets hit, say, in the Northern Fleet or the Pacific Fleet, I wouldn't be surprised because they feel far too comfortable in the seas. We have already struck both Russian ground positions and strategic positions, but there remains one so-called maritime component. That's why in the near future, most likely, if you remember, or rather if you haven't noticed, the main intelligence directorate has gone quiet some. They carried out operations in Vladivostok against the Russian Pacific Fleet and then went quiet somewhere, not ruling out the possibility that yet another Russian submarine might sink. And Putin, as always, will say, well, what happened to the Kursk, to the submarine? It sank. What happened to the strategic aviation? It burned down. What happened to the Pacific Fleet? Well, it broke down into quarks. So these two might happen. Let's wait. There's probably still a third serious blow ahead. And about this first one, you were right to point out the triad. You're emphasizing it correct. Why? Because the air component is one of the main components, and it was the first to be put into service. It is specifically the strategic bombers that make up Russia's strategic nuclear arsenal. Malyuk strike demonstrated that this component no longer dominates the world unequivocally. Why? Because, well, a $500 drone or simply a sufficient number of drones can practically destroy Russia's strategic aviation. This is possible. Everyone understands perfectly well that we have now entered the era of drones, the era of unmanned systems. It feels like in the near future, planet Earth will turn into a kind of planet Chelyabinsk. No water, no vegetation, no mineral resources, inhabited by robots, in other words, populated by these kinds of drones. And in the end, this apocalypse that was once shown in Hollywood movies could very well become reality. So this significant problem truly does exist in virtually all countries across the globe that have heavily invested in robust strategic security mechanisms and defense systems. I mean, what was the point of investing tens of trillions of dollars over the last 100 years into something that in the end, the $500 drone can just take out in a matter of seconds, as Malyuk demonstrated? That's why I would say that Malyuk and the security service of Ukraine have become the cornerstone at the beginning of a new era of security with different mechanisms. The real investment should be in robot speed, that, I mean, obviously drones that with minimal funding can accomplish major tasks. Basically, all these strategies will eventually be rendered obsolete. Once, if anyone remembers, Reikinmai, he rest in peace, had a great monologue where he said something like this: where are those six-story fools, the dinosaurs? Where did they go extinct? But the little bug, it's been living and thriving there for 30 billion or however many 3 billion years. That's more or less what the next era will look like. In other words, the little bugs we're talking about now, the small drones, they'll keep getting smaller and smaller, but without losing their combat effectiveness. And in the end, what will they come to? Exactly what Putin recently predicted together with Skabieva and all that Russian media riffraff. Ukrainian combat mosquitoes. You were just laughing about combat mosquitoes. Believe me, when billions of Ukrainian combat mosquitoes invade Russian Siberia or beyond the Urals, I won't even comment. There won't be a single Russian left. They'll be drawn to them by the scent. And the Russian spirit smells so strong, it's unbelievable. No filter can help with that. You have to put on gas masks if there's a Russian feather standing nearby. So naturally, following the scent, these Ukrainian combat mosquitoes will wipe out the whole Russian herd, this entire Russian federalist herd that attacked Ukraine.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet of Russia, how feasible is it to carry out a special operation there at all?
Well, it's definitely possible. As for the Northern Fleet, on the one hand, it's simply closer because it's just over 1,000 kilometers away, and we've already carried out missions there before. Olenia is not far from the base, yes. So this direction is basically possible even with long-range strike systems launched from our territory. And as for Vladivostok, in some ways, that's even easier. We've discussed before, what is Vladivostok, really? Well, it's Zeleny Klin. It's the far eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, which is populated not by robots, but by Ukrainians. Well, Ukrainians, for over 100 years, tens of thousands of Ukrainians were brought there under certain programs, mostly from the Poltava and Chernihiv regions. Why is there an airfield called Chernihivka there? Well, I know this, for example, from the airfields. Chernihivka and also Ukraine Katies are people from Poltava natives and residents of the Chernihiv region back in the day. Naturally, genetic roots make themselves known, and Vladivostok is actually one of the main jewels of this green wedge of ours, our Ukrainian one. Vladivostok, of course, getting there is a bit of a challenge, all the more so if, in the end, we recognize the government in exile of the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, then it could even, for example, sign agreements with, say, Japan regarding the return of those so-called disputed islands. Well, they're Japanese islands, and even Sakhalin is a Japanese island. So this issue needs to be addressed there in parallel, of course, putting pressure on the Pacific Fleet, because there are Ukrainians in the fleet as well. Do you really think there aren't any of our midshipmen there? Yes, practically every other one there has our good old Ukrainian roots among the midshipmen, because back in the day in the Soviet Army, all the warrant officers were Ukrainians, and all the midshipmen in the fleet were Ukrainians too. So believe me, if it comes down to the survival of our nation, this so-called call of our ancestors will make it possible to sink practically the entire Pacific Fleet. And if we approach our relations with the Japanese and South Koreans the right way, they'll even help us, because it's in their interest too.
Roman Leonidovich, when I spoke with military analysts, they said that the Topol and Yars are part of the powerful nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation. How important are these assets? And, for example, is the destruction of a Topol or Yars a realistic goal for special services, Ukrainian ones, of course?
Well, that's rather difficult, of course. The thing is, these are, after all, strategic forces, missile forces. That means there is a certain selection process for service. There are some aspects related to polygraph testing, so there's very strict control over this particular component, and it would be very difficult, for example, to get close enough to destroy these missiles. The Russians will ruin them themselves. Well, knowing that they're all butterfingers, they'll ruin them themselves. The Topol is an excellent missile. It was first launched, I think, back in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. And then the Russians refined it to a more or less acceptable state. But the main foundational, so to speak, basic starting conditions were, of course, still in the Soviet Union. There was a good school there, a rocket school, especially after our Ukrainian basically put everything into the rocket program. If you remember, that is, while Khrushchev was the general secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, he accomplished this task, and Brezhnev finished it off. Again, both of them were Ukrainian. That's why the rocket field, of course, was very well developed in the Soviet Union. The Russians picked up on some aspects, but because the Soviet Union collapsed and the components of the overall production cycle ended up split among different republics, they were separated. By the way, the main ones were with us, specifically in Ukraine, because we built the same SS-18, the same Satan missile. It was us who built it at Yuzmash. Naturally, the Topol is a continuation of this kind of missile program, especially the Topol-M. It's quite a good missile. The next one after it is also, well, not exactly a clone, but it's basically the same kind of missile, just with a different warhead, with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. That's the Yar. After the Topol, then the Yars, the RS-24, then they built the RS-26. They tried to build the Oreshnik, also known as Rubezh. That's the Rubezh. Putin called it Oreshnik. And the next line, the fourth missile, is the RS-28, which is the Sarmat. Well, the Sarmat can't even get off the launch pad. Out of 7 launches, there were 6 explosions, and several silos were completely destroyed. And most likely, this whole series of missiles has been scrapped. So basically, they won't really have the Sarmat. and with the Oreshnik, they'll just run around like a fool with a sieve. Once its potential for information pressure runs out, at least that's how I see it.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
I forgot to, but there are two missiles that are serious and problematic for us and for the whole world as well. Those are the Topol and the Yars. They can travel more than 10,000 kilometers intercontinental. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. Both the Topol and the Yars have nuclear warheads, and the Yars has multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, each with self-guidance, about 6 warheads that are deployed. So this is truly a serious problem. But it's probably not as much of a problem for us because, well, these are nuclear weapons and the Russians aren't going to use nukes against us. And using a conventional intercontinental ballistic missile on their own territory would be like using a microscope to hammer in nails. So this isn't a problem for us. It's a problem for NATO generals, for the Chinese as well. In other words, these are long-range means of destruction. For us, the main problem is the Iskanders. The Iskanders, the KN-23S, and the Kinzhal missiles, that is both ballistic and aeroballistic missiles, these are the ones that need to be neutralized. The optimal way to neutralize the use of these missiles is, of course, to destroy the Russian hydrocarbon industry, because everything depends on something, on diesel, on gasoline. They fly on aviation kerosene. The hydrocarbon industry must be destroyed. Bankova has ensured the safety of the Russian hydrocarbon industry. And that's where the problem lies, because it's very difficult to defend against a ballistic missile. We should have had our own a long time ago. It's already the 7th year. We probably could have set up serious production of these missiles, but so far they still haven't appeared. Well, we hope that in the end we will get demauer ballistic missiles. But the real problem for us, of course, is the Russian Iskanders. So first of all, we need to destroy the entire Russian hydrocarbon industry, all their oil refineries and everything related to fuel production. And secondly, of course, air defense, that is increasing the number of anti-ballistic systems like Patriot and SMT. There is no third option.
Roman Grigorievich, you have always said that we need to turn our attention to occupy Crimea. And so this SBU carried out a successful special operation, then blew up the bridges near Melitopol. Yes, these are very important logistical hubs that connect the occupied peninsula with the occupied south of Ukraine. And essentially, this cuts off the enemy's grouping. How do you assess the situation now? For example, last night there were explosions, and during the day, the explosions in Crimea continue. We are attacking military targets. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, in Crimea, they've packed in like sardines in a barrel several million Russians from beyond the Urals who were promised something grand there. In other words, they've increased the number of Russian cattle in Crimea. Naturally, they've also crammed in military facilities there for almost 11 now, the 12th year. Before that, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was stationed there. We allowed it, well, mostly our so-called great leaders who looked so far ahead that in the end, they lost Crimea. Initially, back in 2014, they allowed the loss of Crimea. So a large number of Russian civilian invaders. They are indeed civilian invaders, and none of the conventions apply to them. They don't even know this. Any Russian who is on the occupied territory of Ukraine is considered an invader, and none of the conventions that protect civilians apply to them. That is, naturally, for us, they are the same kind of invaders as all the other so-called Russian military combatants who are in Crimea and are subject to elimination. Eliminating them in Crimea, in principle, is not that difficult. Why? Because Crimea itself is a closed area squeezed between two seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. In other words, it is practically a ready-made geographic operational cauldron with only 2 entry and exit points. From Taman via the Kerch Bridge and through the land corridors connecting it to mainland Ukraine. Mainly, if you look at the railway, it goes toward Melitopol. You're right, through Henicheskos are the routes. That's why it's important for us when liberating Ukraine to start by liberating Crimea, because it's much easier to free Ukrainian territory if we liberate Crimea first. Moreover, it's even easier to liberate Crimea itself If you compare the ratio of forces and resources needed with those required for liberating Donbas, you need an order of magnitude fewer forces and resources to liberate Crimea than to liberate Donbas. That's why, without a doubt, Crimea is simply begging to be the very first to break free from Russian captivity. There are many mechanisms for this. How can this be done? Well, first of all, of course, we need to cut off all the bridges that connect Crimea to the Russians. There are several of these bridges. Well, the first bridge is the Kerch Bridge. Moreover, there are several there. A railway bridge, a road bridge, an energy bridge, a fuel bridge, and a water bridge. All of these are part of the Kerch system. That whole system is the Kerch Bridge system. And without question, all 5 of these bridges need to be destroyed in this regard. The second bridge nearby, next to the Kerch Bridge, is the ferry crossing. The floating docks need to be destroyed. The floating docks and, of course, especially the railway ferries. The third bridge among the general ones is the so-called sea bridge. That is, these are the same LSTs, large landing ships, which can be used as ferries between ports, for example, from the Russian Black Sea coast to our Crimea. There are still several large landing ships left, and the Russians can use them to transport a significant amount of weaponry, serious tonnage. Then there is the air bridge. Well, the air bridge is a bit simpler. That is, these are planes, these are airfields that can be targeted, and in principle, the air bridge can be cut off. And the main one, of course, is the so-called land bridge, the land corridor that the Russians are now trying to hold on to. 80 kilometers deep is actually very difficult to do, especially when it's pressed up against the Azov coast. There are several branches running there, both highways and railway lines. So, of course, those can be targeted as well, starting from Rostov, Taganrog, then through the Meuse, then across the Kalmius via the bridges. But realistically for us, it's very close, about 80 to 100 kilometers to Melitopol and to the crossings, both types, meaning the northern crossings. And in principle, that's probably what we'll do. So these strikes that happened simultaneous both on the Kerch Bridge and the bridge near Melitopol area, precisely on the railway junctions. And that's exactly what this is about. First, cut off the supply systems and then hit them with long-range strike assets, which we have, well, everyone understands perfectly. If we manage to gather nearly 1,000 drones for Moscow, then we can definitely find 500 drones for Crimea once a week. The main thing now is to retarget specifically to this component. And the milestone regarding the liberation of Crimea is the third strike on the Kerch Bridge. You could say that the liberation of Crimea will begin with this strike. First, with long-range strike assets, they will dismantle Crimea molecule by molecule over the course of, well, 6 months, maybe even a year. Realistically, if you break it down by actions, first, for several months up to a year, we need to strike military targets in Crimea with drones and missiles. And only then, starting next spring, or maybe even during the summer campaign of 2026, will our troops actually move into Crimea by land. But that's the optimal scenario. Of course, without air support, it's impossible to advance there. That's why I think that by next spring, we'll already have a sufficient number of aviation units to support the ground operation. And of course, we're going to keep harassing Crimea from all sides.
All in all, the summer of 2025 in Crimea promises to be a hot one.
Absolutely. And the Russians really need to start remembering. We talked about this back in 2023. You said they need to learn how to swim because the Kerch Bridge won't be there. The exits from Crimea will definitely be under control. So the Russians will have to paddle out of Crimea freestyle, breaststroke or doggy paddle if they don't leave now by car or train, because those options simply won't exist.
Run, Russians, get out of Crimea. Friends, please like this video. Let us know in the comments what you think about our special operations, about the second and third phases of the SBU special operation. And Roman Grigorievich and I continue discussing the SBU Operation Web, which according to US Senator Richard Blumenthal, can be put on par with the elimination of Osama bin Laden. He called the operation itself proof of Ukraine's skill and determination. He said that these strikes disprove the false narrative that Ukraine is losing the war and could shift momentum in Washington toward increasing aid to Ukraine. They can hit air bases 4,000 miles from Ukraine. They can strike anywhere. In terms of sheer skill and audacity, these attacks can be ranked alongside the US raid on Osama bin Laden and the Israeli operation with trains as some of the greatest military achievements of recent years. Roman Grigorievich, please comment.
The Americans weren't shocked by the fact that we struck the Russians. The Americans tried this situation on for themselves, and now they're shocked to realize that their air bases are just as exposed as the Russian. They were protected from each other by treaties. That is, there were certain, if I recall, under New START, there was specific protection for strategic strike assets provided by these treaties. Moreover, one of the main conditions was that these planes had to be accessible for monitoring by external surveillance systems like satellite. So it turns out that both the Russians and the Americans are required to park their planes on sites visible to the opposing side. But we're not adversaries, are we? No one told Malyuk that. He hasn't even read the New START treaty. Naturally, he went ahead and struck at the Russian strategic bombers, taking one issue off the table. And now the Americans are thinking, wait a minute, the same thing could happen at their bases too. And their bases are wide open. Nobody's even touched them. Honestly, if the Chinese or the Houthis or the Iranians or the Russians set out to take out the American strategic forces, there's nothing stopping them either. And if the Chinese get serious about it, it could be a real problem. We can see that in this regard, the Chinese are ahead of everyone else in the world. So that's their problem now. They weren't shocked by our so-called audacity. They were shocked by their own vulnerability to these kinds of strike capabilities, like Drone 7, simple, cheap drone.
Yes, Roman Grigorievich, today I read a brilliant analysis by a woman on Facebook, a Ukrainian patriot. She wrote that the whole world, which is afraid of escalation, of nuclear escalation, which didn't give us long-range missiles, which didn't give us Taurus and other missiles that could have destroyed this entire nuclear triad, they're simply shocked and frightened that Ukraine managed to do all this without their help. Isn't that right, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, that's exactly how it is. Credit to the person who saw it this way, someone who is closely connected to military matters. That's exactly how it is. What was important in the last century, the previous century, is now absolutely irrelevant, just as what was important in the century before last was irrelevant for the last century, right? No one nowadays remembers slings or boomerang shear. I don't mean rockets. No one remembers bows, arrows, or spears. No, in other words, in the last century, when rockets and airplanes appeared, and now we're already at the next stage. So what was needed in the last century is simply unnecessary now. Strategic bombers are no longer needed, nor, for example, is the same Navy that used to consume trillions of dollars. I mean, just think how much had to be invested, trillions of dollars. And here it turns out with a single decision to eliminate Russia's strategic aviation, Malyuk has basically crossed out this almost century-long saga of, to be frank, looting the world's largest military budgets. Trillions of dollars were invested in this, and now they're simply unnecessary. One of Ukraine's security services basically gave a big middle finger to this entire strategic triad, no matter what form it takes. Moreover, even the nuclear component of this strategic triad doesn't scare us for one simple reason. We have nuclear strike capabilities that are much more powerful, stronger, and more problematic for the enemy than theirs. A nuclear warhead, when it explodes, sometimes it's not even clear whether it was a nuclear detonation or just a powerful conventional missile only. A radiometer can tell the difference. The radiance from radionuclides that accompanies a nuclear explosion, if it is a nuclear explosion, fades quickly. And believe me, if you were to scatter spent fuel rods over Moscow, as we've said many times before, even Lenin would rise from the dead. Yes, he would be more alive than anyone from the radiation that would fall, say, on Red Square. If the Russians use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, everyone understands this perfectly well. Why have they gone quiet about the nuclear topic now? Because they perfectly understood that it wasn't for nothing that a hole was poked in the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And who knows what might fall out onto Grandpa Lenin? Maybe a third head will grow and start running around saying, "You're on the right path, comrades." Well, more or less wherever they're told to go.
Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up, let me ask you the following question. First of all, after the SBU attacks on strategic nuclear aviation, Z channels reported the following information: that in Moscow, Lieutenant General Sergei Kobylash, the commander of the Russian Air Force, accidentally fell out of a window. And now everyone is starting to count how many strategic bombers we have destroyed or eliminated. That is 41 have been damaged or destroyed. How significant are these losses? Please comment on this as a final point.
Well, if this isn't information psychological operation IPSO, and it could be a Russian IPSO, they sometimes inject this kind of event into the information stream through certain questionable channels. Then if the opposing side picks it up, for example, they present it as something negative, then they show this kobiliash, yes, and we'll talk about how we are not quite the right kind of people in this regard. That's why for now, since there is no confirmation and there really isn't any, we treat it this way. Although, strictly speaking, given the responsibility, well, kobiliash should have been flying. Whether someone will make him fly or has made him, or will make him in the future, that will depend on the Russian special services. Because if we're talking about responsibility, it was specifically Kobilyash's responsibility to ensure the security of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. So if not now, then later he left to fly. How could it be otherwise?
Dear audience, please like this video. Roman Hryhorevich and I meet 3 times a week, discuss the most pressing military topics, and celebrate the successes of our Ukrainian special services and the armed forces of Ukraine. We thank them. Our deepest respect, the well-known analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Hryhorevich, thank you very much. As always, see you again soon this week.
Goodbye.